Hungarian Nightmare by Against the Odds, a magazine game that came with issue 31 of the magazine. It is a game that depicts a siege started by the Soviets in World War II to take control of the city of Budapest that was at the time defended by German and Hungarian forces. An area movement game with a very beautiful map, not exactly an entry-level game because it has subtleties and unusual procedures and small rules here and there to capture specific aspects of the conflict. Also not a game that is particularly fast. It takes quite a while to play. In any case, let me show you the map, the units, and tell a little bit about the procedures and rules of the game. Here's the map for the game. It is quite large. It seems larger to me than the average magazine game map, and certainly is a beauty. So thematic, it just adds a lot of flavor to the experience of playing the game. At the beginning of the game, you need to set up the game, and it may take quite a bit. And after you set up, you will see a situation where Soviet and Romanian forces aligned with the Soviets will be surrounding the city, as you would expect in a siege situation, and then you will have a ring of Hungarian and German forces inside the city, defending the city and trying to defend, in particular, the central areas of the location. Victory is based on the ability of the German player to defend downtown, to defend the downtown of Budapest. In particular, area 16 is this area here. If the Soviet player takes control of it and there are no units belonging to the German player in that area, the Soviet player wins the game immediately. So there's going to be a lot of attention here that the players will pay to what happens in this area and around this area. We have the Danube River with bridges which slow down movement and also make it dangerous to cross a bridge if an opponent is in an area adjacent to the bridge, because the opponent may pretty much execute opportunity fire. Movement of the unit moving through the bridge is interrupted. You resolve the attack and then the movement is completed. A turn starts with a joint bombardment phase, which is divided in first a Soviet air bombardment. The Soviet player has air points that can be used to bombard areas in the city. Then there's the joint artillery phase. Both players can use artillery assets to perform artillery attacks against the opponent by using artillery units, or, for example, the Soviet player also has artillery points. And then you have the movement phase, during which the first player first and the other player next will move units from area to area. There are different costs that need to be paid, especially depending on the presence of enemy units in the area that you're entering or leaving. Also, bridges, as I said, influence movement. Usually in the standard game, the Soviet player goes first and the Axis player next, but you can adopt an optional rule that will make the turn order a little more unpredictable. I like that option. Actually, I like it much better than keeping things too predictable, too straightforward, always with the Soviet player going first. The player that gets to move has two types of movement available. One is administrative movement. Units can move up to twice their movement allowance, which is the number printed at the bottom right corner of each counter. They can move up to twice that much if they do not leave an area that contains enemy units and do not enter an area containing enemy units at any time. Otherwise, they simply execute regular movement, which is up to their full movement allowance. And again, the number of movement points that you spend depends on the general situation of the area that you're living, the areas that you are entering, that you're moving through. And when a unit enters an area containing enemy units, that unit must end movement for that turn. After all movement has been completed by both players, you resolve combat, which really is the flesh and bones of the game. And, well, let me show the map and the units a little more up close to discuss how combat works. Some general concepts. Units have 3 numerical values on them. One is fire combat, the other one is assault combat and movement. There is also a letter that indicates morale. Units are very often multi-step units. Some units do only have one step. When a unit takes a hit, then the unit is reduced. Some units have more than 2 steps, and indeed they're represented by multiple counters that you place one on top of the other. Well, at least that's what I do, so that once I set up the game, all units are on the board. I do not have during gameplay to interrupt gameplay to remove a counter and look for the corresponding counter. In this case, for example, if that unit takes a hit, it is flipped like this. If it takes another hit, I remove that counter. Areas also have 2 numbers. One is a black number, which is simply used to identify the area for setup purposes and for other game purposes, but has no direct impact on gameplay. And then you have a red number, which actually is very important because it is an indicator of the urban density of the area. The higher the number, the more density you have due to the buildings present in the area, the harder it is, for example, to perform a successful assault, the easier it is for the defender to ambush the attacker, things like that. Combat. In each area that contains units belonging to both players, there may be combat. Combat is not mandatory. The combat phase will simply end either when combat is resolved in all areas where it could be resolved, or when players decide to end it. Combat will last a variable number of combat rounds. That number is recorded on that track there. And in each combat round, only one player gets to act. The active player will roll a die, say to attack, and then the raw result is used to determine whether that player will retain initiative and will get to act in the next combat round, or if initiative goes to the next player, who then becomes the active player. If the raw number that was rolled is an even number, then the initiative stays with the current player. If it is an odd number, goes to the next player. Dice are not included with the game. You need D10 dice, and as you can see, I'm using a black one and a red one because I find them very thematic, and they also allow me to resolve simultaneous rolls without any ambiguity. Also, another very important thing, as you can see, the combat round track has 2 lines of numbers. One on top simply indicates the number of the combat round. Combat round 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. But then there is a numerical range under that. If the number that was rolled during combat falls within that range, then the combat for that area is over. In this case, for example, I rolled a 5, the range there is 1 to 3, then combat continues, then next turn I roll a die, I rolled a 2, which does fall within that range, and then combat in that area is over. You reset the combat round track and you move to the next area when combat may or may not be resolved, depending on what the players choose to do. So it is very cool that you do not know exactly how many rounds combat is going to last, how many opportunities you have to perform what you want to perform, because of course, as you will see, there are certain sequences of actions which are particularly advantageous. Ideally, if you're attacking an area, you will want to bombard the area with artillery, then to launch a fire combat, and after that, after you have potentially weakened the defenses of the opponent, you launch an actual assault. But if you go through all that sequence, and maybe the opponent also is taking a combat round or 2, things become risky because it is possible that combat will be over before you actually launch your main assault. So in a situation like that, you will have to assess your risk, and you will have to choose whether to launch a hasty assault or to plan an assault that is preceded by, well, wise maneuvers and wise actions, but because of that, if you delay things too much, the attack may not take place at all. So your options when you are the active player are to execute fire combat, to execute assault combat, to use bombardment, or to pass. When you use fire combat or assault combat, you do not have to commit all of your units. You simply choose the units that you want to commit to that. You total, suppose that you're resolving fire combat, the fire factor of all units that are firing, that you select for firing, and they have to be undisrupted units. You total that, you look at the combat results table, you take into account all of the modifiers that may apply, in particular the terrain modifier of the area. You cross-reference the number of fire points that are firing with the result, and you will find out what happens there. There can be step reductions if you have a numerical result, or units that suffer the step losses are disrupted. That is actually not or, that's an additional effect. A unit of the opponent may lose a step, and if it is still around, is also disrupted. Disrupted units are pretty much useless. You mark them with a disrupted marker, and at the end of the turn you will roll dice for each such unit to see whether or not the unit is able to recover from disruption. Bombardment, well, you resolve that simply using the bombardment table. Nothing too complicated. There's the bombardment table. If not, there is this cool idea that actually if you're bombarding an area that also contains your own unit, the results may apply to both players. So that can be a little tricky. But what if you're resolving assault? Oh, that is the most fun part of the game, because it's urban combat. When you're assaulting a position held by the opponent, you're not sure whether combat is going to be simultaneous or if you're going to be ambushed and the opponent is going to fire first. So when you declare an assault, after you declare the units that you want to use for the assault, you will roll on this table. You roll a die, applying these modifiers, again, terrain of the area plus other factors, and you see where the modified results fall. And if it is in this range, then attacker surprise, you, as the attacker, fire first. Don't count on this happening very often. It really will not happen very often. Simultaneous fire, both players resolve fire at the same time. And defender first fire, well, all committed, again, the defender fires first, and if all committed defending units are disrupted, you treat this as simultaneous fire. But many cases I found that combat will be simultaneous, or the defender will get to fire first. In that case, the defender fires, you apply the effects of the fire, and then the attacker gets to fire. Also, in case of simultaneous fire or defender first fire, after combat has been resolved, all units of the attacker that were involved in the assault are marked as disrupted. If I were to capture the experience of playing Hungarian Nightmare in a single expression, what would that be? Probably slow meat grinder, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I guess it depends on how much you like meat and grinders and slow things, whatever. Let me elaborate a little bit on that. The game has things that mechanically I love a lot. I really like. The combat system to me is just a little gem. So much uncertainty, so many decisions, you do not know how many turns combat, how many rounds combat is going to last. You have to gamble your forces on an attack that may never take place. You may launch an assault too early. A lot of decisions there, and the combat somehow feels right. You have the challenge of the terrain, units that become disrupted, a lot of challenges there in, especially the Soviet player, keeping your strengths effective, keeping the pressure of the attack on at all times. As the Axis player, you have this nightmare situation. Your forces are getting beaten up slowly and painfully because the Soviet player pays a high price for that, but it is happening. It happens gradually. You have to start rushing units around to reinforce parts of your line that are about to fall, that seems to be about to be broken by the opponent. You have that Air 16, which obsesses you because losing control of that entirely means losing the game, and sometimes you will make regrettable decisions simply because you're so desperate to retain control of that. Powerful challenges for both sides. I don't know which side is quote-unquote more fun to play. I played the game solitaire, so I played both, and actually I found that the game works incredibly well as a solitaire game. Because there's no hidden information, there is enough uncertainty and randomness, especially when it comes to combat, to keep things fresh and interesting, because you cannot see too much far ahead. Great game for solitary gaming. It also has a lot of small rules and things to add historical flavor to the experience. There are rules about German supplies, there are rules about control of airports, Hungarian desertions, a lot of those things that may take a little bit for you to absorb, but once you quote-unquote get them and you factor them in as part of the experience, definitely add to the overall historical immersion that the game can give you. One of the things that is the strongest is one of the strongest things of this design, is probably also one of the weakest ones, and one that will not make this game a crowd pleaser, I believe, is the pace. The pace is very realistic. It is a siege, an urban siege, in which the defenders simply wait for the opponents to come out, and they try to inflict as much damage as possible before they retreat to a new area, or maybe decide to hunker down there. In any case, it is a slow, painful, incredibly painful process, in which, well, this is precisely what happens. The Soviets keep pressuring the areas. They get beaten, they inflict some small damage, they reorganize themselves, they push again. It is a slow meat grinder, in which combat really has the biggest role in the experience. This is mainly a game about combat. You will spend most of the time resolving combat. In comparison to all the combat rounds, each of which is almost a mini game, the phases in which you move and you execute bombardments will really be fast. You have to enjoy that. You have to enjoy the historical advantage that you gain by a situation which depicts historical urban siege this way, which is realistically with the right feeling of how it must be to be on one of the two sides of that siege, in which there aren't sweeping fast maneuvers. It is about fighting for control of each single building, of each alley, etc., etc. So the game is overall repetitive. You move and then you simply go through all the areas to resolve combat. Also, this is one of the reasons why I think that the game works well as a solitaire game, because if the process becomes tedious after a while, you leave the game there, you go back to it the following day, you look at the situation with fresh eyes, and actually you are again excited to see if you'll be able to achieve a certain breakthrough in an area or to prevent a breakthrough from happening. I enjoyed the game as a solitaire. I do not know that the game would necessarily shine as a multiplayer game, or at least I should say as a multiplayer game that you only have a session to play. If you can play in several sessions, you break down the experience, then the fact that there's a certain repetitive aspect to the design probably will not be a problem. So overall, Hungarian Nightmare, a very good war game, definitely a war gamer's war game, not for the casual war gamer, not just because of the complexity, but because, again, of the feel. A game that definitely will appeal to those that are interested in the topic, but a game that may not be quote-unquote too exciting in terms of pace and variety of the actions. A good game, nevertheless.